Hey everybody, welcome to Game Audio Hour number 79. I think I memorized that. This is it's our weekly podcast where we discuss all things game audio, from creative ideas and latest techniques and all those things that you always hear me say every week that are kind of boring because you have to hear them over and over and over. I think we should cut that intro like back to back for a year and just see what happens with my tone, my excitement level, and how many times I screwed it up. Here's where you'll find in-depth coverage and opinions related to game audio. Vince!
Hello!
You laughed at my joke, so you get to go first. How you doing?
Oh, man, I'm doing okay. Last week, I showed a little RME box. This year, I'm showing an RME manual. Wow, this is a thick manual.
I know it.
I'm so used to little pamphlets for sound cards. This one is proper reading material. I love proper reading material for any software or hardware that I acquire. I think it's great. I still haven't actually used the thing, but I'm really excited about actually reading it.
Are you having trouble sleeping? Is that what you're getting at? What's going on? Is somebody you want to hit over the head with that thing?
Audio interfaces are exciting. I'll just say that. I freely admit to it.
Well, they are. Mike, what is your thickest manual?
I was thinking about that. I still have the old manuals from the very first edition of the Vienna Symphonic Library, where this was really kind of a bridge to an older era of documentation, because you would get a big, thick manual. I think there was one describing the whole suite of instruments, and then they would give you a manual outlining each patch with a diagram of the key switches. It was absolutely insane. It's as if someone was going to pick up like a small phone book and flip through it just to see what the key switch to the trumpet was. It was fascinating. So eventually I realized those were online as PDFs, and I wasn't actually going to ever look at the PDFs anyway, so I threw them all out. But for a long time I had a shelf that was mostly taken up by those manuals.
Oh, the days of tech writers and when people treated them with respect, huh?
I don't know about that.
How about you, Alex? What's your feeling on tech writers and huge manuals?
Huge manuals. The last actual print huge manual that I read was the Yamaha SY22. Oh, yes.
Isn't that like
well, thanks for that, guys. You know, I'm glad you're
I remember that one.
Yeah, isn't that some sort of like ARP generator or some kind of like song arranger or some kind of device?
No. The SY22 is a what would you call it? It was a wave. I guess it would be wavetables. No, it's not even wavetable. I don't remember.
Yeah, I think it was. It was like, isn't that with the Yamaha AWM? So that's their version of wavetable, I think.
Yeah, and it has the joystick in the corner that you can morph between four different patches at once. So to figure out how to use that cool joystick,
yes,
wax on.
The SY22 incorporates two synthesis systems, AWM and FM, so advanced wavetable and frequency modulation, and you can go between them with that joystick.
That's right. And I remember in the menu system there's actually a setting in the menu system for FM amount, and me and my buddy didn't know what FM standard for, so we just called it Fat Mama, because when you turn it up, it just gets fat.
Mama.
Fat Mama.
Say synthesis systems 3 times fast. Everybody.
Synthesis systems.
I mean, Vince just ripped it right off the tongue like a true professional. But then when I started to say it, I thought, oh, I'm just gonna.
Well, Frida's joining us in the chat room. Maybe we can ask her to do it for us.
Frida would just nail it in 1,000 different dialects and genders, 1,000 different genders.
1,000 different characters, you mean?
First take Frida.
Unfortunately, she's union, so we'd have to pay her scale.
Oh, boy.
So I have this chart that I like to use that I sent around to you guys, and you said, hey, Kyle, why don't you share that with the show like an idiot, like you probably should have done a really long time ago. And so I guess I'm going to do that. But I thought, you know what I should do is just bring it up and we'll talk about it really quickly, and then I'll put it in the chat. Or maybe I should put it in the chat first, and then we'll talk about it. I don't know. You guys are professionals. What should I do?
Put it in the chat room so our loyal followers can see it while we talk about it.
Sounds good. Let me get my phone to stop blowing up. And how do I send a file to the chat room? Does anybody? Oh, I see it. I see a button that says send file. Drag the file here. Could it be any easier? I don't think so. It even
Surely
said
it can.
uploaded. I think it's there. Have fun with that chart. And I will share the screen now, like a professional show.
Ooh.
And coming.
Oh, nice. Look at this.
Zabading.
All right.
There it is. Let's
Okay,
talk
so
about this.
this is really interesting. I kind of have issues with this chart.
Uh-oh.
I think it's really, really. I mean, it's super useful.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are things here that are, fairly fundamental.
Oh, get to it.
But I don't know. I mean, well, yeah. I mean, sort of just mainly up the top, like no boost in the sub.
Uh-huh.
From 200 to 800 hertz, keep clear / minimal. 800 to 6K, be subtle, careful. And then, like in between 6K and 8K, there's this nice treble clef, which I guess may be the sort of the goodness zone. You know, you just boost anything in there, and you get sort of trebly stuff. And then you've got 8K to 20K is subtle, 12K boost. These kinds of charts, there's a nice little middle one. There's like rumble, boom, punch, warmth, tinny, crunch, definition, and then splitting up into the various areas of like bass, kick, snare, hi-hats. I don't know. It sort of seems a bit prescriptive, sort of a bit kind of formulaic somehow, that, you know, regardless of what sound source you're putting through this, you must be subtle and careful between 800 to 6K. I mean, obviously it's just a recommendation. And I've noticed down there, bass 1K adds beef. I mean, this is good science right here, isn't it? This is good. This is good acoustic science.
For a very long time in America, we were wondering where was the beef.
That's right. It's clearly at 1K. That's what you were missing.
We have now found it.
If only that woman had lived to this day to hear the answer to her question.
What this chart tells me, and this is very, very important, is that if you write a piece of music that only exists between 250 and 350, it's going to be a perfectly mixed piece of music. Because apparently right there, everything's good to go. 250 to 300, I guess, is what it is. Right there.
Yeah. I thought it was like about 7K where the nice kind of treble clef is, because, you know, when there's a treble clef, it must be kind of music, right?
Well, I'll tell you what. I love this chart. I don't care what you say, Mr. Alex May. I love this chart because it is a great way to show people when you're doing something like getting rid of some of the muddiness, what you're looking for, you know, because we don't always visualize that. And also, another way that charts like this, and this one particularly has helped me, is that when I think it's muddy and I realize it's not, I'll start looking in the other frequencies, and then when I figure out, oh, it was more roomy than it was muddy, and I realize that I was cutting now down there, it made a big difference, and it tells my ear, this is the difference between roomy and muddy. Another thing is almost everybody internationally describes, or with musical experience or not, describes music in the same way. They'll say, oh, it's too tinny, or it's too muddy, or it's too bassy, or it's too, you know, and you can go to this chart and go, well, here's what they're probably hearing. And if you make an adjustment there, especially for those of us who work for people who aren't necessarily musicians, but they're making a final decision on the situation, this is a lexicon right here where you can go to your boss says it's too crunchy, too tinny, you make some adjustments in this area and go back.
Needs more beef. Needs more beef. What can you do for me here? We need more beef. Okay, 1K. Dial it up. We have beef.
Dial it up.
I think.
But
I agree
wait,
with
you don't want to boost that. You want to cut rather than boost, right?
That's right. Rule number 1.
Yes.
Cut rather than boost. Right at the top.
Yes.
Broad boosts, narrow. No. I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious. I do understand that this kind of chart is extremely useful. And as you said, Carl, there is a tendency for people to use, especially in English, to use similar words such as, you know, punchy, warm, tinny, crunchy. You know, I don't know about air, but presence, I suppose, muddy. But I guess the thing that I'm not so sure about here is it sort of encourages mixing with your eyes instead of just listening. And even if it's just a case of grabbing a node in your parametric EQ and just sort of pulling it around until it kind of sounds better.
Yeah.
Even that in itself, I think, because you're approaching it basically from a sound point of view with the whole thing, rather than just thinking, oh, well, this is a kick drum, so I need to look along the orange line. It's a bit too muddy, so I've got to look there for the muddy section. It's between 600 and 800.
You just reminded me of something I do in Ozone a lot, which is when I hear something, like I'm hearing the whole thing, but something in there is making a sound I don't like. I try to make it with my mouth, which is nearly impossible, and people laugh at me. But then the second thing I do is I do a node push off of like the EQ in Ozone, and I select it so I'm only hearing what's inside that bell. You know what I mean? And then I move it around until it sounds like what I think I'm hearing.
Right.
Or something, and I'll get in there.
Yeah, one of the
That's a good trick. I don't know if people know to do that. I hope so.
Yeah, the graphic, those kinds of EQs with the spectrum, they're fantastic. I mean, things like, of course, iZotope Ozone. Did somebody say iZotope? Yes, iZotope Ozone. Yes. As well as all of the other ones, you've got like FabFilter's Pro Q, you've got DMG Audio's Equilibrium and eQuick, and let's see, there's Acorn Equalize, and there's like loads of them. But yeah, the good thing about them is when you have the capability to solo bands like that, it's really such a good way to sort of problem solve without needing a chart. You can just sort of move the band around until it sort of sounds like the problem area that you're thinking, and then just pull it out, or add more, or whatever you need to do.
Now, add on top of that, should I let this go? The screen share? Or should I leave it?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You can let it go now.
All right. So on top of that, though, I also like to see my waveform. I am so spoiled now. There was a day, a very long day that lasted like 15 years day long, where the only choice that I was used to was tweaking these knobs and using your ears and guessing what frequency you're at and what you want to boost or cut. You know what I mean? And God, I love software because now I can see like the waveform, and it'll be like really peaked in the mids or something, and I go, that's exactly what I want to make less of. And that's why I really love FabFilter stuff. iZotope's doing it too.
Do you guys, when you're mixing, do you mix with a spectrum analyzer, or do you prefer to just leave all the visual stuff off and just use your ears, so to speak?
Can I do both? Because that's what I do.
I think the spectral analyzer is useful to me when there are subtle low-end frequencies in an instrument that shouldn't have any. And it might be something that I'm not quite picking up ear-wise, but I can see the depths of the bottom end of the spectrum, a little bit of bumps, the flute or something, because maybe the air conditioner was on in the room. I find it very useful for those kind of cuts, just to see stuff that obviously doesn't belong there. But I do try to rely on my ears rather than eyes most of the time.
Right. How about you, Vince? Vince is muted.
I am muted. Sorry about that. Sometimes I think actually these last 2 years made me very worried about my ability to hear things. And I found myself relying a little bit more on that spectrum analysis and being able to keenly observe things. I think before, some of you, if you've heard some of the earlier shows, you know that I was having these issues with my ears that turned out to be an allergic reaction to something going on in my room. And I think one of the things that has happened in the last year is I found myself using the visual much more than I did in the past. And I've found little tropes, little nuggets in the visual, in the spectrum analysis that I sometimes act upon even before I hear it. And something that I've been surprised by is the fact that that's been more successful than not, actually, when it comes to motivating changes in the mix, EQ changes, compression changes, whatnot. So I would say, a few years ago, I would say it's all about the ear, and now I'm actually much more even in my use of both the spectrum analysis and my ear.
Yeah, I'm the same. I'm also very because I have to do work in a lot of different places. Sometimes I have to use headphones. Sometimes I'm here at home. Sometimes I'm at the company side or whatever. I think that I'm also very concerned about my ability to actually hear the finer details of things that I need to hear as I get older. And it's sort of helped by. Let me just share my screen here if I can. Let's see. Screen share. This one. Okay. All right, can you see that? It's probably really dark, but can you see it?
Yep.
So this is what my Renoise screen looks like, and this whole area at the top that you can see, this is one massive, big, fat spectrum analyzer.
Yeah.
I'm not going to try and play this because it'll probably crash my machine. And right here, we've got next to the spectrum analyzer, this is a phase scope right here. So I'm kind of a bit spoiled in that Renoise has this big spectrum analyzer that's built in. So it's always there and it's always on. I can turn it off, but because it's there, I may as well use it. So yeah, I found myself. So how do I turn screen share off? No. Anyway, there we go. Yeah, I found myself kind of relying on this more and more. Just very useful when it comes to especially sound design. And if you're not really confident that you can hear the things that you need to hear as you're working, having the spectrum analyzer there just sort of helps. So this is the same person who just a moment ago was saying, "Oh, we shouldn't be mixing with our eyes; we should be mixing with our ears." So I think I just sort of shot myself in the foot there. But
what though? There's like I'll pick up. Okay, so a CRT monitor will send an interference at 17,800, I think. And you won't hear it, but it's in your file. And so Spectrum Analyzer is really great for those things where you see a peak. I think it's if I'm not mistaken, Bluetooth does it at 22K, 22.1, something like that. So sometimes I'll see audio files that have these peaks. And I'm thorough. I don't want to leave those in there. And had I not brought up a Spectrum Analyzer, I wouldn't know that they were there. And that way I can just get rid of stuff like that. I think it is an absolute important step to bring that thing up and just look at it for a second, if nothing else, and just go, okay, everything looks fine. And also, I'll play a piece of music. I'll highlight something I'm mixing and hit the space bar, and it'll only show the frequency which is highlighted. And if I've got a problem area in that area and I hit play, but I can't quite figure out what it is, it'll jump. You'll see a peak, and you go, oh, I didn't realize it's over there at 18K or something, or, well, who am I kidding? I'm old. I don't hear 18K anymore. I barely hear 100K. So it's down there in, K. Johnson land of hearing range, and then I'll go, I see it now. I wouldn't advise that for a whole piece of music, like highlight the whole thing and just hit play, because you're not going to see those kind of jumps. But man, these tools are there for a reason. And remember, guys, I am an ex-programmer, and nothing pissed me off worse than when I would have this interface in front of me that I could build amazing websites with, and some Luddite would walk up to me with TextPad or something and say, I build my websites here. And why the hell are all these tools existing? So I say, get in there, use the tool, it's what it's for. You're only hurting yourself if you're trying to be some... Never mind. I'm going to get off my soapbox. I'm going to drink my rum, because that's what I've got, too. Today is Pirate Rum. I don't think it's Pirate Day, but it's Pirate Rum. See how they spelled it wrong? They were drunk when they created it. Pirate.
It looks like it's the word pyrite with a couple of vowels chopped off for fun. So
it's kind of like the difference.
Fool's gold.
Yeah.
Oh, hey, I'm stuck on Alex. I love it when I talk and I get stuck on a person. Hi, Alex.
Hi. So do you guys while we're just on the topic of EQs before we move on to the next topic that we have, and also sort of related to that chart, do you guys use or do you think of EQs that emulate analog gear? So obviously they're going to look like they got knobs and they're not going to have spectrum analyzers, and the kind of stuff you'll be able to do will be much more primitive and limited. You've got Poletech emulations, you've got APIs, you've got Neves, all the different kind of analog gear emulations. I have to admit, most people will kind of know this about me, but I sort of have a bit of an obsession with collecting them. So it's horrible, because you said, oh, I can hear that this needs more clarity. So I know what I have to do, but now I've got 10 different EQ plugins that I could use just to boost my 10K or whatever. Do you guys use these kinds of parametric sort of analog emulation EQs, or do you strictly stick to highly functional, highly practical tools like Ozone and ProQ and those ones?
Make it work, I actually have a couple of those plugins, and I play with them, and I think that they sound cool, and then quite honestly, I forget about them. It's been a while since I've actually put one of them in one of my projects.
I think you know the company PSP.
Hmm.
They're from Poland, and they do their most famous plugin is of course Vintage Warmer, but they do a whole bunch of other stuff as well. One thing that I like about their approach is that for times when you want to get, as they say, surgical, you're going to have tools for that, such as previously mentioned tools like ProQ and Ozone. But if you're going to go to sort of an analog emulation, the sort of reason that you want to do that is either for that placebo mojo, that kind of feeling that, well, this is a Poletech, therefore it's going to sound really good on a kick, so yeah, Poletech. Their approach really is that the times that you want to use that style of interface is when you're after speed. It's not so much a case of sort of surgically going in there and fixing up issues. It's more of a case of just slapping it on there, dialing a few knobs, getting it sort of sounding right. Now it doesn't sound right. Pull that off. Pull that on. Just up down, cut boost. Sort of very very quick. And that's the reason why their emulations, the knobs actually go between fixed frequencies on most of them, as opposed to being a sort of a continuously variable potentiometer. It's sort of like a click 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 between frequencies that they've chosen.
Yeah.
Just with the idea that the only reason you'd be wanting to use a plugin like this is to get sort of a ballpark sound as fast as you can. So I've often found that the position of mixing within the workflow, this was actually leading into our second topic of today, but at least for the kind of music that I do, it tends to help to have mixing broken into two phases. A pre-mix phase, which is when you're doing the sound design and you're actually tracking and writing. So you're sort of doing a basic pre-mix. If you're like me and you've done your sounds in synthesizers, then you'll part of the process of creating the sound will be actually pre-mixing it, and that's where these kinds of very quick kind of slap it on and smile kind of EQ plugins they're really great, because you don't have to break that flow of when you're sort of in the mood and things are working. You don't need to break that mood, because it's just so quick and easy. You just slap it on. Then after all of that's done, after the tracking is all done and the song is all there, that's when you go into sort of the post-mixing, for me anyway. And that's when you may break out the spectrum analyzer style EQs to give the sort of surgical cuts where there are problems and make things kind of fit together better.
Well,
Do you guys...
It's often said that mastering is more EQing than anything, and mastering's at the end of that.
Right. Do you guys, when you're working, do you tend to try to? I used to try and shift mixing all to the end so I wouldn't get distracted by it, but I've just found these days that personally, I just can't do that. It all has to kind of happen together for me. But how about you guys? Do you mix before, after, all the way through, and where does the place of spectrum analyzer style EQs versus kind of knob twiddling EQs, where does that fall?
Well, I'm very opinionated in this area, so somebody else better go first.
I was going to say my process is similar to what you described. I'll do kind of a quick and dirty premix just to get a ballpark sense of the levels and maybe what the end product will be like with EQ enhancement. And at the end of the game, I'll throw away the rough mix and redo it with a little more attention to detail, and that's when I might use the spectrometers and stuff like that. I do in between try to force myself to get as good sounding a mix as I can without any stereo bus plugins. The temptation can always be to throw up, that's a terrible choice of words, to insert Ozone or some other lesser stereo bus plugin and throw in all the magic and make it sound sparkly, but I really have tried to discipline myself to get a good sounding mix before slathering on the mastering stuff. So that type of discipline I found rewarding in the long run.
Yeah, well, that's very, I don't know, that makes sense to me. I do something very similar. I think mostly because if I get into a mix, I get tired, aka bored, really easily. I like working within those big, broad changes while the composition is actually happening from the 0% mark to the 100% mark, and I would love it if that mix process that is at the end is really, really small. So I try to make things sound pretty good, or even really good, well before I get into that mixing mastering point. And then, okay, I guess I'll have to do this now.
Kind of, actually, Mike was touching on his workflow there, which is kind of our second topic. So why don't we make our special announcement and then move on to the second topic? What do you think, Kyle?
Well, I wanted to talk about mixing for a minute.
Okay.
So I think where it starts is to have your speakers as flat as possible. People are going to be, misled right away with having colored sound coming off of their monitors. So get that as flat as possible. I stay out of a mixing mindset because until the end, because if I have flat speakers and I'm doing some orchestration and I'm not hearing enough bass, I might be tempted if I'm mixing in the middle to kind of nudge up the bass on something. And instead of doing that, that tells me maybe I need more cellos rather than to nudge up the bass. And so then I'll go investigate, getting some more weight on that end of the spectrum. Then once I feel like I'm listening to something on flat speakers that sounds pretty balanced, then that makes the mixing job a lot easier at the end, because now I'm just touching on areas that need some improvement or need some highlighting or something like that. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
At risk of delaying the exciting news we have to deliver today, Vince said something that triggered off a tip that I've actually always wanted to give our viewership, and I just want to throw it out there really quickly. I have to be really careful how I use the word throw today. It's just a dead hit danger. So Vince was talking about the danger of being bored by your mix, and I think that's a phenomenon we all can run into either during the composition process or during the mixing process. And I want to share everyone a tip I found to be very useful, and this works best with MIDI composition as opposed to live composition. But if you've been listening to the same cue over and over and over again and you're starting to not really hear it, open up the transposition box in whatever DAW you're using and change the key. Modulate it up a half step or down a half step, just temporarily. You'll find that you're hearing the piece in an entirely new way. Even though it may be tonally very similar, suddenly it's giving to make a rough analogy, the worn out muscles of your basilar membrane a break, and you're hearing the pattern of the cue. It's just sitting in a different place in the tonal scale. Now, I'm not trying to say change the key and then you're done. You'll probably want to change it back for the mix, because sample libraries in particular can drastically change as a result of just shifting up a half step or down step. But often I find this revitalizes the cue just to me and allows me to retain enthusiasm when I'm bogging down and kind of not really hearing it again. So that is my secret tip from me to you, and it was just a segue or a tangent from what Vince mentioned earlier that seemed relevant.
That's a cool tip.
That's really cool. Actually, illustrators do that a lot too when they're drawing on paper. One thing that they'll do is lift the paper up, turn it around, and hold it up to the window so they're viewing it backwards. And if you've ever tried that, if you've drawn, if you've ever done sort of intensive illustration, it looks completely different when it's backwards, and it just reminds you of how much your eye sort of gets used to the form of what you're seeing, and sort of looks unbalanced, but you can't figure out why. Well, a good thing to do is if you turn it around and look at it backwards, it's like, wow, look, the head is huge, or this part is all out of shape, or so that's a really cool tip. I imagine that shifting, if you think about it as notes in the piece being different points on in a frequency spectrum, changing the key will shift everything up or down, which is really going to give you like a drastically different experience of your mix compared to where you've been used to doing it. So that's a really good idea.
It can also reveal some weaknesses if you've been relying on your sample library. Let's say you're doing an orchestral cue and you're doing it through an emulation, and you may be taking advantage of the fact that a given sample at a given pitch has maybe a kick to it that's not really part of the instrument, but it just happens to be part of the sample. And if you modulate up or down, maybe you're getting rid of all those illusory advantages that aren't really good orchestration. It's just happenstance by the combination of sample libraries you're using. So in addition to revitalizing your ear and kind of rekindling your enthusiasm, it's a good way to really listen to what you've written or a version of it and let you focus on the music rather than some of the details of the production. And again, this is very useful with sample libraries.
Actually, just going back to EQ, I want to touch on, before we make the announcement that everybody's waiting for, Chase has got a really interesting question that deserves attention, I think. Chase's question in the chat room is it bad to use plugins, for example, like WaveArts, that is almost 10 years old? Is there a real difference in comparison to the math in the EQ of, say, a 10-year-old WaveArts plugin versus something modern, current, and up-to-date, like iZotope, Ozone, or FabFilter, Pro Q2, or any of the sort of new EQs? That's a really, really good question. Most people would say, well, if it sounds good, it is good. Math is math. If you've got a 10-year-old plugin on there and it still sounds great to you, then yeah, use that. However, yeah, what were you saying there, Carl, about from the engineering side? It's kind of an interesting question, I think.
I was being sarcastic, so I would just, actually, Matt M brought up a good point about how different companies programmatically are handling phase, things like that. Floating point used to be an issue a really long time ago, so I was being sarcastic and saying if you got software that's dealing with that, then yes, please upgrade. But that software is probably 20 years old now. There's only so many ways that you can skin a cat, as they say, or peel a banana, and there will be 1,000 different EQs out there, and the majority of them will all be doing it the same behind the scenes. So I look for features more than I look for anything. Like if I have an old EQ that's 10 years old that doesn't have a display in there that I can see the waveform, then I would upgrade to that one because I want that advantage of having a better way of dealing with the audio than just tweaking some old knob. But in the end, it is your ear that makes the difference. Even if it's really old software, if it still sounds good to you, that's the rule of thumb, isn't it?
What's the oldest plugin that you guys still use regularly? Not instrument, actual plugin for effects and processing.
The brand that was just mentioned in the chat room, WaveArts, had some really good plugins. They're still usable, but I'm still using their multi-band EQ, I think. It's a multi-band compressor. I find that useful now and then. I've got some presets on it that I'm reluctant to let go of.
How about you, Vince?
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Kyle?
Please, go ahead, Vince.
I think the oldest ones are probably these Sonatus plugins, which are definitely about 10 years old. And their delay, their phase, their multi-band compressor, they all sound pretty good to me, and I'm just fast at manipulating it, so I'll often go to those first, even before the much more advanced ones.
I think mine's the GRM tools, their Doppler effect. I still use that a lot. Although I think they've upgraded it, but I really don't know. I've just got some old install of it.
Cool.
So, on to the exciting part.
Well, thanks for asking me. That's fine.
Sorry.
Well, all your plugins are from 30 years ago, so.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I deserve that.
What is it?
PSP Oldtimer is probably about 5 to 10 years old.
Is it called
Oldtimer?
Or are you calling it an Oldtimer?
It's called PSP Oldtimer. It's a very new compressor emulation, and there's been so many compressor plugins that have come and gone, but still that one is still just seems to hang on. PSP have a knack for making sort of pseudo-timeless products. Anyway, enough about me. Let's get to what everybody's been waiting for, Kyle.
I want a new software. Oh wait, no, you didn't pick my name, did you? So we'd like to take a moment in this show to say thank you to iZotope, because they are our new sponsor, and we love that to death. And it is amazing the software that you get from iZotope, from a breadth of software, from instruments to plug-in effects to mastering to mixing. There's nothing they can't do better than most, that's for sure. I know I spend my day in RX almost every day and use the heck out of Ozone and Insight and just so many things. So thank you, iZotope, for sponsoring the show. With that being said, iZotope has allowed us as a sponsor to give away a free license to Iris 2, which we announced last week. And throughout the week, we had all kinds of people tweet and say the magic words that entered you into the contest, and we collected all of those names and those sayings into a sheet. And Alex May, right before the show, went into a random integer generator on the interwebs, say that 3 times fast, and came up with a number, and I'd like to announce right now that number 7 won. Congratulations, number 7. We will be contacting you. Actually, number 7's name is Valerie Stegeman. Valerie Stegeman, I hope I'm saying that right. Congratulations. You have won a free copy of Iris 2, and we will put you in touch with iZotope for the delivery of that license code. Again, congratulations. Thanks for watching the show, and thank you, iZotope, for hosting or supporting us in your sponsorship.
Whew.
That's pretty awesome. Now I got to go over to the chat room and see how many people are yelling at me.
Everybody logged out.
Everybody's got, well, screw this, I'm out of here.
I'm posting the name in the chat so we can make sure.
I don't know that Valerie's actually in the chat room today.
Well, I'm still going to put it
Does that mean is she disqualified because of that?
That is not true. You are never disqualified. Thank you for watching the show. Thank you for tweeting us. Thank you for participating in the chat room. At whatever level you participate in our show, we appreciate that no matter what. We really, really do. And thank you, Valerie, for putting in the magic number, 7. If you'd have known it was 7 in the first time, everybody would have applied for position 7.
T Porter 64 says, "Congrats, Steak Man. I really hope that you know her." Mr. Porter.
Maybe it's just the internet made me sound like Steak Man, but it's Stagamon. Either way, it could be a really cool villain in the next Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
Along with Iris 2, you get free public humiliation from all members of our show.
Yeah, right? You know, with the name Johnson, I never ran into that, so I'm kind of jealous. What's your name, Johnson? Nobody messes that up.
Wow.
Anyway, so let's move on to the next subject. And here is the next subject. It is a very deep and very intense subject. As I have purchased some new orchestral software. So I have to add it into my template. And I have my template divided into strings, brass, percussion, woodwinds. What color in your template do you make those sections? That is something that always pops into my mind.
I never
Good one, Kyle.
color sections. Mostly because everything just changes from piece to piece. And if I'm going to be coloring things, I'm going to be coloring clips that might be in sections. So if I want to, okay, my flute has the melody. Well, that's important there. And then my oboe has the melody. That's important there. But my flute, which is doing some just extra harmonic stuff along with the oboe, that's not important there. So like individual clips, I'll actually color code. But I rarely actually color code according to instrument or sections.
Wow, you are a rebel, my friend. What about you, Mike? What do you do?
I'm going to answer a slightly more abstract form of the same question, and that is, what kind of visual mnemonics can we use to help us quickly identify different ensembles in the virtual orchestra? Like Vince, I don't really colorize sections, though I think it is possible in Logic. But what I find is very useful are the icons that accompany each track. The primitive little picture of a saxophone or whatever it is. I found those extremely useful, and I find myself setting them for just about every track. In addition to ordering the tracks in some approximation of standard score order, if every woodwind instrument has this sort of generic bunch of woodwinds lying in a pile icon, I can quickly hone in on this. And in my younger and reckless days, I wouldn't do that, and all the instruments would be scattered around, and I'd spend all my time looking for things, and it was a real hassle. So I found that the investment of a little extra time to organize by proximity and also by similar icon was well justified.
Before Alex answers this question with his Technicolor tracker, I would like to know, I'd like you guys to know you teased me on this subject, and there is an all-out fight happening in the chat room. So, live and learn. I know where the true meat on the bone is.
Yeah, it's
Matt
at 1K, isn't it? That's where the beef is.
Matt Ullman says that brass has got to be yellow. Brown works too. But Chase says that brass is orange, and Matt says heresy.
Well, I think like Synesthesia 101 tells us that the sound of an instrument probably inherits the color of the physical instrument itself. So it's not a real stretch to say that brass has to be yellow because brass is kind of yellow to begin with.
Yeah, yeah. And Alex, brass is, let me guess, purple?
Yeah, so when you, for those who don't know, when you work with a tracker, you see all of your music data at once, which is good, but it's also bad because it means that you've got all of these tracks lined up in front of you for your whole song, and that means that color coding becomes important for the single reason of just being able to tell one track from the next. And so I color code just based on contrast. So if this channel is red, then I won't make the next one yellow or orange, because then it's kind of harder to see. So this will be red, that'll be blue, then the next one will be green or whatever. Just like making sure that they're as contrasty as possible. So that was a bit boring, wasn't it? Sorry.
So I do a crazy thing. My percussion is white, because white's a color, right? Isn't it? Or is it the lack thereof? It's along there. I do my strings as brown. I do my brass as yellow, because it should be. I don't care who you are. I do my woodwinds as green, like an earth tone. Isn't that a beautiful choice? Aren't I brilliant? Could you please wash me over in gorgeousness? But when I look at charts, like online at other people's templates, I'm always amazed at all the different colors that they've chosen. And I looked at a chart today where everything was some sort of like indigo, and I thought, oh, my strings cannot be purple. Oh my gosh, no. I would never be able to write music if the strings were purple.
Unless it was clown music.
Yeah, right? Right? And I think that came from like a really lofty source that was doing them in purple. Like if John Williams put out a color-coded thing, it would, So we probably shouldn't make fun of whatever that source was. But I thought, oh my God, purple. Purple strings are just impossible. I need to ask these guys what they use. So should we get on to a more serious topic about orchestration?
Let's.
Yes, let's.
Alex, do you want to do it in your fancy accent?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. I'd love to hear it.
So looking at actually Kyle's chart that he showed earlier, when he was sending that around prior to the show, I was thinking that that chart is fairly. I mean, a lot of them are very generic terms that people use in English to describe sound, but you've got snare and hi-hat, and it sort of seems to be geared towards modern popular music. Which kind of made me think that if I was Michael Gordon Shapiro, not so much is this chart useful for me, but actually how does Michael Gordon Shapiro work when you're dealing with an orchestra? Because there's something that I've never had the privilege of doing, is like mixing an orchestral cue. I've never had the privilege of doing it because it's not really my wheelhouse, but I'm really eager to ask a whole bunch of questions. For example, what do you do about EQ? How do you work differently with sort of all-in-one style orchestral packages like Orchestral Essentials? One orchestra in a key kind of situation versus individual parts that you're mixing individually. How does that change the workflow? How do you use compression? How do you use reverb? Where does the mixing take place? How do you adjust for sort of loudness normalization with orchestral cues, which inevitably are going to have a greater dynamic range than modern popular music? These are my questions.
Well, these are excellent questions, and if you rent the Mixing with Mike video series, now available on demand from Vimeo and Hulu, you will get the answers to this and many more. So a real answer is there are two scenarios, and one is which you've recorded an acoustic orchestra, and the other is when you're working with sample libraries. And you can subdivide the second scenario into wanting a fairly naturalistic sound, or wanting a hyper-real hybrid orchestra, larger-than-life, remote control kind of sound. So if we rewind back to when you've recorded a live ensemble, I find that my main use of EQ is corrective. If I mentioned the scenario where there was some air conditioning left on when recording and you've got like a low rumble, EQ is very handy for removing those artifacts. Compression, on a track-by-track basis, I might use it to make a soloist stand out a little bit, particularly if I was recording kind of pop style as overdubs. If everything is one pass and I've got spot mics that give a little more detail for the individual sections or maybe the soloist, then maybe there might be some application too. But I'm not going to use a lot of track compression on a live ensemble. And when it comes to the mix, then maybe just to add a bit of thickness or overall brightness or sheen, then you might find yourself adding a little bit, like a high shelf here or there. But I tend to make very subtle use of those tools when I've got tracks that were recorded live. Ideally, I'm not making any use of them because I have a budget to hire an engineer, but there are some circumstances where that's not true and I have to be the engineer, so I'm very conservative. Jumping to the other scenarios when you're working with sample libraries, this is a much more interesting question. Some sample libraries are giving you sounds that have already been tweaked on the EQ side, and a lot of extra EQ messing around with might be redundant, might be bananas on bananas. But the same issues can come up. There might be sound that's just way booming, and you need to just scrape away some of the bottom end so it can coexist happily. You might find a sound is kind of dull, or different sound libraries have different tonal profiles. Maybe one is brighter and perkier than the other, and you need to make the sounds from one library sound commensurate with the sounds from another. Those are things that come up. Different sample libraries have different mic perspectives. I still have the original Vienna Symphonic Library, where I think that was all one mic position. And it had this crazy character of sounding like it was a kind of middle-of-the-room mic until you hit a certain velocity, at which point it sounds like the microphone was dropped into the lap of the player, and all of a sudden it's huge and loud, and sometimes a little bit of compression can help counter those effects. If you're doing a kind of Hans Zimmerian, larger-than-life, punch you in the face with the brass section, then all bets are off. You might find yourself using EQ and compression and other tools like that very analogously to how you'd use them on a pop record. You might want to have really intimate control of the spectrum of different instruments, the brightness, the clarity, and realism may not be a factor. You just may want as much raw visceral power as possible. I don't do a lot of stuff in that department, but when I do, I find myself using EQ much more as a coloristic tool and not being afraid to do things that aren't completely real. Like maybe the ostinato is on a flute, and in real life there's no way you could hear that flute with the rest of the orchestra barging on, but you can push that flute to the front of the mix, and suddenly you've got this breathy, kind of wistful, wispy, kind of interesting sound doing a role that might normally be a percussion role. So that is probably way too much information relative to the scope of your question, but that's what I was able to come up with on the fly.
Not enough. Not enough. We need more information. That's good. One other question that came to mind there was, what do you do about the inherent wide dynamic range of orchestral music? So if you're writing for a game and you've got sound effects and explosions and all this kind of stuff happening, and you're wanting to sort of squash that dynamic range down so that the music remains audible above all the sound effects that are happening, are you just doing that, just sort of squashing it using various tools, or is instrumentation a stronger tool there to make sure that the orchestral music remains, relatively natural sounding and yet still audible amongst sound effects and things happening in the game?
Well, with game music, you have to take a probabilistic approach because you never know exactly what kind of sound design your music is competing with. Unlike a film, where you have at least some idea of what's going on in a given scene, games, it's a probability curve. Maybe there's a big explosion, and maybe it's a quiet forest scene. So I find it helps to play it safe and just make your music reasonably loud so it can coexist happily with whatever's going on. It may be the case that on-the-fly mixing technology will get really smart, and maybe they can do that stuff dynamically. Vince might know more about the state of the art in that department. But as a heuristic, I would say just try to avoid the extremes of dynamics in any game level or scenario where there might be a lot of competing sound. You might use a little bit of compression on the mix bus and then use a tool like, I think it's the maximizer in Ozone, or if you're throwback using WaveArts, I think they had something analogous called the finalizer. But you bring down the ceiling a little bit, you bring everything else up, and you sacrifice a little bit of the peaks in order to get a larger and maybe more present overall sound. Vince, is there does the state of the art of dynamic mixing offer that kind of intelligence where it might actually change the compression profile of music to take advantage of a relatively quiet moment and then squash things when it knows there's a lot of gunfire?
Yeah. Well, like with the stuff that I've been doing lately, and it's kind of basic for a lot of people, but just being able to embed markers and utilize callback functions on the playback of music so that you could read that embedded data and it will say something like, I don't know, -3 dB. Actually, someone on the chat room was asking about, how would you deal with noise floor on low dynamic passages? And one thing that you could do is just, well, I'm going to render everything relatively high, exposed to the right, get it up so that you're using the maximum amount of dynamic range that you got. Hey, we got these 24-bit files, and just use that embedded marker data. And we've got these middleware tools. Let's have our AI mixer just ride the faders according to what the embedded data is in the music. And it actually works really well that. It gets a little bit harder once you have much crazier sequences, like, oh, we've got a big battle and lots of gunfire, and we got to use those as variables that are going to drive how much compression, how much further you want to push things down, etc. But just on that basic level of including a marker in the wave file that you render, and then using that to say 2 dB down, 5 dB down at this point, whatever, that's actually really easy with even the last, 4 or 5 years ago FMOD and whatnot.
Yeah, I think Wise also has capabilities for doing on-the-fly sort of normalization of assets so that they, during times of the game where there's a lot of sound happening, you can use that as a kind of parameter to adjust the volume of different assets as they play.
So you guys are talking about ducking, right?
Yeah, well, I was.
Okay, got it. I wanted to make sure I was paying attention.
Well, ducking is kind of, if I understand it, you're just taking a volume level and dropping that down to accommodate something else. What I was wondering about is the analogous process, but for dynamic range. So, like if you think of two scenarios, quiet forest, and apocalypse. In quiet forest mode, you might want to allow a wider dynamic range because you know the music will be audible, but there's no way you can anticipate that when you're writing the music. I guess if you're writing music for quiet forest level, you have a little bit of insight, but it might be cool to actually compress the music on the fly because of how much of the spectrum is going to be available to it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what's great about software compressors is that you don't have to duck just you don't have to duck just volume, like in the old radio or television commercial days. You could duck a dynamic range by affecting not the volume of something, but yet the bringing up the lows and keeping the highs down, which is the whole point of sidechaining a compressor. Mm-hmm. But one thing I like is what Vince was saying about automation is, and I don't work as much in middleware anymore, so I'm trying to think if it's something that I did in Wise, and I'm sure it's there, but I can't think of it right now. But when dialogue comes in, and like on a forest scene, obviously you want to make some of that music from the forest scene go away, like you were talking about. And when dialogue comes in on some massive battle scene, you want it to go away as well. But you don't want it to be so noticeable that the dialogue remains the same in both of those moments. The dialogue has to be harder to hear in one of those massive war moments. That's the whole idea. That's why the voiceover artist is screaming and yelling and doing that. And so in automation, I can think exactly how to do that, but I can't think of how I would do it in Wise because it's been too long. What do you do in those cases in something like a middleware tool like Wise?
I think if you can tie your necessity for adjusting dynamic range into a real-time parameter, or RTPC as they're called in Wise, you can easily assign, compression threshold and compression ratio and makeup gain to react to that parameter. So, for example, if it was like a very primitive case would be if it's possible for the programmers to adjust an RTPC from 0 to 100 depending on intensity, which they may be able to pull out of the game engine from a bunch of different statistics and things like that. Then you can have your compressor react in real time to this intensity parameter, which would sort of give you that real-time dynamic range adjustment that you're talking about, Mike. But there's probably a more elegant way to do it in Wise, because Wise is just anything can sort of be plugged into anything in Wise. So there's probably a better way to do it. But that's if it's possible for the programmers to give you that kind of parameter, then that's probably the simplest way to approach it.
We need a good we need a show where we do that. Where we show some examples of that, because RTPC is exactly what I was thinking. I just couldn't remember the letters.
Do they call them RTPCs in Fmod as well, Vince?
Yeah, basically. Well, real-time parameters. Yeah, they're just called parameters, I think.
Okay.
But yeah, they're pretty much interchangeable. And what was I going to say? The compressors in Fmod are really not that bad. They're not fancy waves or whatever compressors, but they're actually really decent. Just want a 2-to-1 compression once you hit -6. Okay, sure, that it's perfectly fine for that, and it will sound really quite decent.
Same with Wise. The one thing that I wish Wise had was some kind of meter to show gain reduction on their compressors, because it doesn't have that. You just got a compressor plugin, and here are your values, and your values can be adjusted with parameters like this. But it's one thing with compression. Hearing EQ points and hearing problems in EQ without looking at a spectrum analyzer is one thing, but being able to sort of semi-accurately hear how much gain reduction is happening inside a compressor and how much you're losing with dynamic range, that takes a real veteran set of ears in audio production. I'm far from that goal myself, but it'd be great to have sort of like a visual representation of how much the compressor is working. Unfortunately, Wise doesn't have that at this stage. Well,
you got me thinking. You hit on an area that I definitely need to learn more about. I don't spend as much time in middleware as I used to, and then I used it at the basic to intermediate level because it's so powerful. You don't have Wise is such an amazing piece of software that certainly the more you know, the more you can do. But you could put a dummy like me on it, and I could still get you something pretty good. That says something about that software. And I also keep getting kicked out of our chat room, and it's driving me nuts. You guys getting kicked out too?
No, it's Chase. Chase is just miffed that he didn't win the Iris 2 this week.
He's sitting on a button every time I log in. It like ejects me.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, guys, that's the show because we started on time.
Ooh.
Hello, anybody out there?
Yeah.
I'm just disappointed that I didn't win Iris 2, so I really haven't been paying a lot of attention to the show since we made that announcement.
But we're not qualified, which is wonderful.
Wait. Next month's contest.
Yeah, you watch out. Well, we will have another one in a month, and right now, I just wanted to say congratulations again to Valerie Stegeman. And thank you to iZotope for hosting the show. But before I go, I wanted to bring up also something that Vince brought up in chat. If you get a chance, go out and check the new website. Darn it, I had it up and now it's gone. Here it is, designingmusicnow.com. They friends of the show, and they just did an interview with Dr. Karen Collins, another friend of the show. Really interesting stuff that she's doing, and she's on to her second Kickstarter doing some awesome things for game audio. So I wanted to make sure to mention that. So go out to designingmusicnow.com and you'll see it at the top, the interview they've done with Dr. Collins. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye, guys.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Don't forget to tweet us. Don't forget to Facebook us. And don't forget to all those other things. And stay tuned.
Yes. Visit our MySpace.
Our Friendster is still up.
Yes.